Ladies and gentlemen, we are about to experience one of the most consequential, arguably, elections, certainly in modern American political history. It's my great delight to welcome Andrea to this session.
Thank you, Tim.
There's been spectacular drama given Trump's diagnosis and apparent recovery, Lazarus-like recovery. But the polling has sort of settled into a pattern. And that pattern is to make it seem that Joe Biden, if he doesn't quite have it in the bag, it's going to take a remarkable turnaround in fortunes for him not to win. So I'm looking at the polling, the poll of polls. The Economist website is very good on this, and it gives Donald Trump a 1 in 10 chance of securing sufficient electoral college votes. He's got a 1 in 20 chance of winning the popular vote, which is a way of saying it's almost impossible to conceive of at this point. Andrea, what are your thoughts? A little under 3 weeks left till polling day.
Well, you raised two important points, Tim. One is that we've been in this position before where the polls were suggesting one outcome and we ended up collectively with another outcome, and that was because of the efficiency of the Trump vote in 2016 on those swing states. It wasn't, he was able to convert, I think, something like 46% of the votes into about 56% of the electoral college votes. And that showed a great deal of efficiency with a really targeted campaign. And electronic media, social media is one of the weapons that was used in that 2016 campaign, with Hillary, of course, winning the popular vote. But in American politics, that's meaningless. You've got to get the electoral college, which was only the 5th time it had happened in American history. There's been a few changes since 2016 to now. The pollsters have really reviewed their practices. They've changed the way that they're weighting their results. So they're putting much more emphasis on education. They realized that they underestimated the Trump vote last time, and they really underestimated the non-college finishers, if I can put it that way. Those that tied education were at equivalent to our secondary school level, and white voters. They also underestimated the number of late deciders. Now, this election's a bit different because, and I think also because of COVID, we've seen much more polarization than we saw in 2016. So we aren't expecting to see as many undecided voters. And we do know that the polling companies have really tidied up their practices, including paying closer attention to regional versus the metro mix and how they recruit, doing a lot more mail out first and then following up with a call rather than relying on online polls. And they're trying to capture the younger voter as well with texting, which is the preferred option of younger people. So I think we can have a little more confidence in the polls. You're quite right. Most commentary suggesting a Biden win at this point, but we have had that big October surprise, which was Trump being diagnosed with COVID, and this somewhat miraculous, and I put that in inverted commas, recovery, and now back out campaigning. And there's a lot of uncertainty still, which we can go through.
And of course, in 2016, I think there's been something of a caricature of how erroneous they were. They weren't that wrong.
It was within the margin of error.
Yes, the margin of victory was well within the margin of error. And it's a bit of undercounting and overcounting here, which I don't put much faith in pollsters, but as far as it's a scientific endeavor, I think they're much more robust and much more wary of their reputations going into this one than they were possibly 4 years ago. Love him or hate him, there is something about Donald Trump which remains unpredictable. That this capacity for dramatic turns is what's marked his entire presidency, and he's nothing if not a remarkable political campaigner. So rather than bask in inevitability, I'd like to explore some of the issues that I think remain and will endure regardless of who wins.
It's also extraneous factors beyond just the candidate of Trump. You're quite right. If anyone knows how to do political messaging and really reach mass audiences, it's Donald Trump. But it's more than just the candidate. It's what's going to happen to turnout. What are we going to see with voter suppression? What's going to happen to court challenges to mail-out voting? And we know from the Wisconsin example earlier in the year, I think back in May, where the governor had ruled that it would be a mail-out vote, and then that got overturned by the court within 12 hours. And it was the Republicans who turned out to vote and ended up capturing large cities that they don't normally capture.
Yes.
And that's got real consequences for this vote, because we know that through some of the research that I've done, that Republicans don't feel the threat of coronavirus in the way that Democrats do. Democrats take the medical advice much more seriously and will be far more inclined to do a mail-out ballot, whereas Republicans will turn up. And then there's the question of intimidation of turning up and how many polling booths will be open. And then not to mention once the vote comes in, how's it going to be counted and what sort of challenges will there be to the way that it's being counted? So there's lots of uncertainty around, first of all, getting the vote, mobilising it, where it lands, and then how it ends up being counted and the challenges to that.
Yes, and you're right, of course, to point out, I don't think I've mentioned it yet, but this is happening during the greatest global pandemic in 100 years. And part of the issue at the polling booths is the issue of social distancing. So we're not sure psychologically how voters are going to adapt to that. I know you've done some really terrific research, which I know is imminent in terms of peer review. Can you explain what it is that you found, particularly in terms of the difference between Australians and Americans when it comes to receptivity to messaging around the COVID virus?
So this was a joint study with University of Melbourne and also University of Sydney with the United States Study Centre. And right at the beginning of the pandemic, we decided that we really wanted to understand what was going on. This was back in March, we had this idea. So we put together a representative survey across the US and across Australia, about 1,000 respondents in each survey, which was fielded in May during the height of the lockdowns in both countries. And the results may not surprise a lot of people listening to this, but they really gave us the empirical evidence to build on. And then we refielded that survey again just at the beginning of September, where in Australia you had a unique circumstance where Victoria was under stage 4 lockdowns, but the rest of the country wasn't, and that America was still very fragmented in its approach. And what we found was really stark partisan differences, polarization differences between the two countries. By and large, irrespective of who you vote for in Australia, there was a high degree of trust in medical experts. I think it was separated by about 1%, whereas there was a 20% difference between Democrats and between Republicans. Republicans still, though, around 80% compared to 99% for Democrats, but a lot different to the Australian experience, where there's absolute confidence in the medical expertise, up around 90%. But we also asked them what sort of media they consume and how much trust they have in journalists and how much trust they have in family and friends all around COVID information online. And what we found is that Americans' trust has gone up a little bit in journalists during this time, as has Australians. And I think that's because there's more on the line. People's healthcare is on the line. But when we look at partisan differences in the US, only 20% of Republicans trust journalists, professional journalists, far more inclined to trust friends and family online. And the trust in journalists is being bumped up by Democrats. And then we see that they're going to very established brands, the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, the Washington Post, whereas we see, as people would expect listening to this, that Trump supporters are going off to Fox News. But I think one of the starkest findings for us was the mix of media consumption. Australians still have a fairly varied diet in the kind of information they're getting. So if you're a Labor supporter, in your top 5 choices of media that you're consuming each day, you're prepared to dabble in some media that probably has a bit more of a right-wing ideology and see what is being represented in that media. If you're an American, you're sticking very much in your polar end. If you're a Democrat, you're consuming media with a, for want of better terminology, a left-wing ideology. And if you're a Republican, you're staying very much in your media that has a right-wing bent. So we're seeing twin peaks, so to speak, occurring in America. whereas we see a much more heterogeneity going on in Australia. And that's important because it means that Australians are getting a broader, diverse sense of viewpoints. They're trusting the medical experts. And the other big difference, of course, circumstantially, is in America, you don't have bipartisan support about how to deal with coronavirus and to limit its spread. Yeah. In Australia, there has been that bipartisan support. And I say that's significant because when you line up the medical experts with the politicians and with much of the media commentary, it's much easier to get a public policy outcome, which is getting people to comply with measures to limit the spread of the disease. You don't have that lining up in America. And so, as we can see, there hasn't been support for lockdown measures. And that was borne out in our study as well, showing only 30% of Americans supported measures to restrict movements compared to 2/3 of Australians. And this helps explain, in part, not completely, I think the success of Australia, notwithstanding some anomalies with Victoria, in being able to deal with the COVID outbreak, and why America's ended up with 212,000 deaths.
But the very good point you raise, I think, Andrea, is the way the United States encounters issues of public policy, particularly public health, indeed of science more generally, fractures along ideological lines in a way, as you described it, just doesn't happen in Australia. We have a technocratic politics. We tend to vote for that party which we think can deliver better outcomes, more action on climate change, better healthcare, better response to COVID. Whereas in the US, as you describe it very well, and in the research that I've read, the United States encounters these scientific questions ideologically first and foremost. How does the adoption of this science, which is being pushed by government, alter the relationship between the citizen and the state?
Yeah, I think there's 2 points of caution here, and you touched on it at the beginning with your opening remarks about Victorians being in prolonged lockdown. So as I said, we did the survey again just to see if there were shifts between May and September. And what we did find is support for lockdown measures were dropping off very much in Victoria compared to the rest of the country, which isn't surprising. As you put people under pressure with this protracted restriction of movement, there's less support for it. However, it was still above 50%. It was about 56% in Victoria compared to the rest of the country being 2/3. So even though there's been some political buck that's been lost with this lockdown and with support for the measures, as you say, Australians do approach public policy in a more technocratic manner. And in McAllister at ANU's written about this as well, about the way Australians consider their politics. But we shouldn't be too smug either, because what we do see in our data is the capacity for this polarisation in Australia. It's not that we don't see any of that movement towards people who support conservative politics moving towards right-wing media and people who support left-wing politics moving towards left-wing media. We're just not seeing the starkness of it and that huge gulf that you see in the US. And here's the common denominator between the two, and I'm sure people are thinking of this right now, is Rupert Murdoch, with that really pulling apart, polarising effect with the types of coverage you get, and moving away from that 20th century mode of reporting, which was about objectivity, the who, what, where, when, and then backing up with quotes. We're now seeing commentary and opinion pervade even the first paragraph of reporting. And part of that, not completely, is the style of reporting that was introduced with 24-hour news reporting in the US and Fox News. And we haven't even got on to touch on the weaponisation of fake news, which I'm sure we'll come to.
We've got a number of questions coming in, Andrea. Let me put this one to you. In 2016, how significant do you think the, quote, "I hate Hillary" factor was? Is Biden safe from that kind of animosity?
I think it suppressed voter turnout. There were those that were Democrats that weren't mobilised to turn up in the way they were for Obama because they just didn't like the candidate. I don't think we're going to see that with Biden. There's every suggestion that notwithstanding difficulties with voter suppression of actually being able to turn up to vote and having enough polling stations as well as having the mail-in ballot, I think this is a really engaged election, and every indication is we're going to see higher voter turnout. And if that's the case, that also underscores probably a Biden victory. The question is quite right. There was a suppression factor in the choice of candidate with Hillary.
Do you not think that the sheer innovation of Joe Biden is going to cost the Democrats votes? Out of 330 million people, 90% of the Nobel Peace Prizes, 18 of the top 20 universities in the world, and the two candidates they could come up with, two septuagenarians, clearly, I think in Biden's case, have politically peaked some time ago. Are we really being presented with a viable choice between the candidates?
It's a safe choice, isn't it? And it might sound uninspiring to us, but America, like other developed democracies, has an aging population. And I think Biden appeals to older voters. We know that older voters are more mobilized to vote. So I think in that respect, it's quite a safe choice. He's also been very safe hands as the VP to Obama and has a great deal of carriage with Black voters and voters of color who see him as an ally of Obama. So while it may seem uninspiring to us, and you've got to remember in Australia, our politicians are getting younger, not older. We've switched around where if you go back to the 1950s, becoming a politician was a second career choice. You'd done your public service, you'd been an accountant, you'd been a school teacher, and then you'd go on and do public service and stand for election. We've gone back from that and we've really professionalised, in inverted commas, our politics, where now it's seen as a first order career choice, that you have your political life and then you go into your next career, whether it be as a diplomat, ambassador, or representing a mining company, whatever it might be. America still values age in its politicians and the years of experience that come with it. And I think that's a difference between the two countries, which might feel uninspiring to us, but also it's countered with the VP choice by Biden. Biden's 77, Kamala Harris is 55. And she also, hits all those opposites. She's female, she's of color, she's younger. So in terms of the collectivity of the Democrat vote, I think they've got it better covered than what you see in two white, grey men, orange men, Trump and Pence.
Yes.
What do you think, Tim?
I share some of that. I am, and I recognise, of course, Biden is a compromise candidate. That because so much of the focus has been on Trump, we've tended to ignore how riven the Democratic Party is into at least two factions. The Bernie Sanders phenomenon is still to burn itself out, pardon the pun, and Biden was the safest way of kind of dampening that conflict. I don't think it represents a long-term solution for the Democrats. At some point, they're going to have to resolve their internal problem. In the same way, I think Republicans are. That what Trump has symbolized is how far Republicans are split on what the character of their power should be. So Trump has posed a problem that both parties have to try and resolve. I think it's one of the benefits, if I can speak in those controversial terms, of the Trump presidency, that it's forced both sides of politics to actually reflect on what their core message is. Can they prosper on the basis of crude identity politics, or must they try and address the middle? And without Trump, it's hard to imagine how that question could have been posed. It's an optimistic reading, I think, of where America might be going.
Well, the sense of identity for the parties might always also resolve itself in some ways for the Democrats, because Biden is an older candidate and may not survive 4 years if nominated.
Yes. Which
means we will see a very different type of president in Kamala Harris.
It is a fascinating prospect. I always think that the demise of presidents is often exaggerated. We've only lost 8 of them. Mind you, that's 20%.
Yeah, that sounds like a lot.
It does sound like a lot. And of course, he's the oldest man ever to hold the office. So Kamala Harris's role as VP and possibly as president becomes hugely consequential then. I suppose my concern then would be that she didn't energize the base. I mean, she promised a lot in the primary campaign and then fizzled. So we're expecting her now to reawaken democratic interest. So I'm slightly skeptical she would have that effect. But if she's VP and Biden dies or leaves the office, then yes, we would have the first woman and the first woman of color in the White House.
The media framing now, of course, is different with Kamala as the VP candidate compared to her as one of many lined up as a nominee. There's a lot more attention on her story. She's had the VP debate with Pence, really held her ground on that, made it clear that she wasn't going to be interrupted as a woman. So I think there's a lot more, column inches, for want of anything else, that's dedicated to her now, that gives an opportunity for voters to get to know her better and to know what her track record has been working as prosecutor.
I think she's had a pretty free ride to this point, and that will stop, I think, as the prospects of real political power edge closer for her. There's several questions coming in, Andrea. Given the rampant misinformation on a number of social media platforms, what role do politicians have to condemn and call them out?
What we've seen for the last 4 years since 2016 is the way that Trump has made fake news a moniker or a label to direct directly at journalists as enemies of the state, and to delegitimize their role in creating a communal space for people to get information that they can trust. And the ramifications of that have been massive. One is that Pew Research shows 88% of Americans say they don't know what is real and what is not on basic facts. So we've got this epistemic crisis occurring where people don't know what knowledge is. Further, not only has Trump demonized and delegitimized the mainstream media by calling them fake news, which we see time and again in the press conferences, but has also done the same thing to medical experts with the way Anthony Fauci has been put out on the side. And in some ways, what he's done is kicked an own goal, because why that may have given him power in those circumstances, when you hit a 1 in 100-year event of a global pandemic and you need to mobilize the public to work in one direction, they are not taking their cues from the mainstream media. They're not taking their cues from the medical experts. They're taking their cues from Trump, who's given us all sorts of misinformation, from injecting
bleach. He wants us to
bleach, into veins, from saying that he's immune, from saying he's been cured, with a lack of medical evidence for that. So here's a real crisis for American knowledge,
yes,
and scientific knowledge,
yes,
that we're seeing. In answer to the question, which I should have said up front, of course they have a responsibility to do this. And I think we've seen with some of the language coming from Biden that he takes that responsibility really seriously. And in a crisis, those that do trust journalists are trusting them more, but it's very much in the US from one side of politics. And I think it's something for us in Australia to really guard against, to be very careful when you start labeling journalists as fake news. And I think there's also a responsibility for the media that they need to refute and push back when they unfairly wear that label. And I remember, in fact, Tim, you were there. We did a session in 2006, just after the last election, with a Washington Post correspondent, Dana Milbank, who said during the primaries, the journalists saw Trump as a bit of a joke. And as a consequence, they wrote about him ad nauseum, and he got all this free media. And when we analyse the 2016 election, we see that the Trump spend and the amount raised was half that of Hillary Clinton. And why was he able to have such traction? Because the free media, the earned media as we call it, gave it to him. So there's a real responsibility from the journalists, not just the politicians, to not mess with the truth in this way and not mess with scientific facts as though they're negotiable, as though there are alternative truths.
Yes, I agree with that we forget, given his incompetence in lots of other areas, that what he's a master at is media manipulation. And this accounts for his success as less as a real estate agent, but certainly as a TV star, which he transposed seamlessly into a run for the presidency. It's a remarkable capacity, which I think the media were complicit in. So my question would be, aren't the media and when we say media, it's not as if there's one building with the word media outside and they're all left wing inside and 28. But the media, what will the media do without Donald Trump?
It'll do what it always has done, Tim, and that is go after the news, which is the extraordinary that gets preference over the ordinary. And in politics, we're always finding the extraordinary. I'm sure if the polls are correct and after November the 3rd, or maybe a couple of weeks after that, it is a Biden presidency, there's, like all administrations, there are moments of controversy. And one of the criticisms that's been aimed at the liberal media is they downplayed some of those controversies under the Obama administration. Yeah. So it might come as a little known fact that the Obama administration prosecuted more journalists than any other administration ever has, which is a pretty remarkable thing for a liberal administration to be doing. Yeah. And by downplaying that and then hyper coverage of all Trump's misgivings, it creates this perception that there's a bias within the media. And again, there's a responsibility here back for journalists to really take their professional roles seriously and make sure there is verification, there is balance, that there is a level of accountability and also refutation when things are just plainly being labelled at journalists that's incorrect.
Yes. The cause of a free media hasn't been helped by their treatment of Trump. And as you suggest, it wasn't helped by their treatment of Obama. To get two contrasting presidents in the way that the media handled them has been, I think, to the discredit of the media more generally, that you can't laud, applaud and deify one and then seek to do exactly the opposite. There are shades of grey here, which I think the media miss. So my provocative question to you would be, isn't Donald Trump just a little bit right about the bias in the American media?
Yeah, more than a little bit. As we've discussed, it's a really polarized environment, the American media, with those twin peaks. And let's not forget that Fox News has gone from strength to strength. It had its highest ever ratings in 2020. 3 million people a day will tune into Fox News, and that even outpaces the free-to-air television stations. And then on top of that, the New York Times this week carried a piece about, under the radar, the impact of AM radio, which we find also when we ask people to rank what's their favourite media preferences, AM radio is in that top 5 consistently. AM radio has 15 million listeners a week, which if you put it in those daily terms like I just gave with Fox News, is slightly under Fox News, around 2 million. 12 out of 15 of those most prominent stations have a right-wing bent with a fairly strident right-wing commentator. So I'm sure your question's probably going to, is the bias to the left, but there's certainly bias to the right. And there is that bias to the left, as we discussed. And the NBC outlined in 2018 the light touch criticism that has been given to Democratic candidates and to presidents. But I think the real problem with the US media is what Mary Lynn Young out of Canada, she's recently written a book called Reckoning Journalism's Limits and Possibilities. And this speaks to the lack of diversity within the journalism profession itself, that it largely speaks to fairly middle-class white values and is inadequate in addressing gender, race, intersectionality and other issues of diversity. And so there we see an inherent bias that isn't addressed by journalism itself. And the other problem, which Australia needs to be very cautious of, is pluralism, to have vibrant and different outlets that get a fair hearing across the public sphere. And we have one of the highest concentration of ownership of media outlets of any liberal democracy. And that's a real concern, that if you end up with a choice between getting the viewpoint from the Nine Papers and the Guardian or getting the viewpoint from the Murdoch tabloids, that there we've got that potential to really pull apart and see some of that polarization that has so shaken American politics, and I would say is making it rather impotent.
Yes, I share much of that. I suppose my response, Andrea, would be, despite the increasing concentration of media ownership in this country, we still have a very pluralistic political debate, which makes me cautious that media ownership is a bit of a red herring, that all the media does is reflect and refract what people are thinking rather than the other way around. So the domination of AM radio, talk radio in the US, isn't an expression of the dominance of that medium, but of the need people have for the propagation of a certain worldview. And the media, because it's in the business of making money and extending its influence, synchronizes with that rather than the other way around. What do you think?
Yeah, we need to be careful of selectivity effects. And there's been 100 years of study about how much impact the media actually has on politics. And it's moved around over that 100 years from having an enormous effect, the propaganda effect or the hypodermic needle effect, to not having much of an effect at all. And I think we've landed now that it certainly sets the agenda. It gets us thinking about what are the issues of the day. And we see that with the way news bulletins line up the stories. And in the US, the way that the Fox media and the liberal media would line up the stories of the day would be vastly different, the agenda setting capacity. I think in Australia, we have a lot more overlap, which is probably why I think you're saying the media ownership's a little bit more of a red herring here. But the other thing to consider is that a point of difference between the two states is we do have a national broadcaster two national broadcasters in Australia. And some research has shown that having a public broadcaster, and I completely realise that it's been politicised to a degree, funding's been cut, but research shows those countries that do have national broadcasters that are publicly funded have less of that polarisation. It smooths out the polarity between the two. And I think there's more research to be done here on what that means for Australia and for the ABC as it gets more and more labelled with having a left-wing bias. But it does have a charter to represent all Australians, and it does have a national footprint, which can't be said for the US.
How would compulsory voting in the US change the outcome?
Oh, I think it'd change it enormously. You probably know more about this than me, Tim. For a start, it means a lot of money wouldn't be spent on trying to mobilise the vote. That part of the equation's already done. It's been mobilised. So then the energy goes into how to separate the candidates, to put forward their issues and emphasis on what the points of difference are. It also gets rid of some of that arms race of campaign fundraising that is so necessary in the States with the super PACs, that we just don't have that ferocity in Australia because we don't need to mobilise the vote. And then the other part, of course, is you get part of what underscores a democracy is not just an informed voter, but mass participation. In the US, I think typically we see voter turnout around 56, 60%. I think it'll be up around 60% this time. In Australia, it's around 91%. So we get that participation. Now, the critics, and you might be one of them, I'm not sure, of non-voluntary voting, of compulsory voting, think that the disengaged, why do they get a right to have a vote? I'll let you speak for yourself there, Tim, but I think it forces a level of engagement that isn't under normal circumstances outside COVID doesn't happen in the US.
The one thing that I've never liked is the fact the state can compel me to validate its legitimacy through enforced voting. There's something so extraordinarily un-American about obliging Americans to vote. It's a system founded on a skepticism of government. The idea that you could compel people to legitimate it seems to me a key point of difference between here and there. I'm also cautious, I think, Andrea, that if you compelled the vote, you would get a lot of those men and women that voted for Trump hadn't voted before. I mean, not a majority, but a significant number. If you compelled them to vote, you may well end up getting more Trumps. It's not a guarantee that compulsory voting would always favor the Democrats. Well, there's that theory, of course, Andrea, that he had no intention of winning in the first place. It was all a large marketing exercise, which he's had to defer for 4 years. And he'll go back to that, of course, with an enhanced capacity for marketing, given that he's been the 45th president. So I would imagine, I mean, Trump, love him or hate him, there is something consistent about his character, about his brashness. There's an authenticity I think we don't appreciate. He'll be exactly the same as he was before, which is loud and opinionated and the center of everything that's important in the world, according to him. So that narcissism, that solipsism unchecked, will mark his post-presidential career. But they're a rarity, of course. Men that only serve one term are quite unusual. You've got to go back to George Bush Sr. and before that, Jimmy Carter. Before that, you've got to go back to 1932 and Herbert Hoover. So he's in a very select group. And he will continue to make a lot of noise and be a reminder to both parties of the consequences, I think, of ignoring an important demographic in the American Midwest, that deindustrialized part, that the coastal elites, the media elites, for too long flew over. So I think that's the positive that his legacy will bring. Perhaps I'm being too optimistic. Andrea, do you want to have the last word before we close?
Oh, thank you, Tim. I wonder whether Trump just didn't, he's a man who's always put deals over policy, over thorough policy analysis. And the real cut through he had in 2016 was to reach out to forgotten Americans, those in Rust Belt states that felt that they had been forgotten. And notwithstanding COVID-19, I wonder how disappointed some of those Americans are going to feel approaching 2020, that Make America Great Again, that striking slogan, will they feel that that's been delivered upon, and will they give him the chance to have another 4 years to try and deliver on it? And as we just saw with that poll, and as the American polling suggesting, the answer is no.
Andrea, it's been absolutely terrific to debate these issues with you in front of a very engaged audience that's asked qualitative questions. And my apologies that we've not got through all the questions that were asked. You've got another 3 opportunities to do this. Can I encourage you to rejoin in this same slot next week when Professor Roger Fairfax from George Washington University in Washington, DC will join us. Professor Fairfax is an expert in the intersection of race and criminal justice, and we will look at the election through those lenses and several others. It's been great to join you today. Again, my thanks to Andrea, and we'll see you all again very soon. Thank you.